You had a plan, a real one. You were going to wake up early, get the thing done, make progress on the project that's been sitting there for 3 weeks like a quiet accusation. And then morning came, and somehow the plan dissolved. You did the easy things. You checked your phone. You found 17 small tasks that felt productive but weren't really the thing. And by evening, you were on the couch, vaguely aware that the day had passed through you rather than been lived by you, telling yourself you'd definitely do it tomorrow. Tomorrow, definitely. And somewhere in the background of all of this is a word: lazy. Maybe you've applied it to yourself. Maybe someone else applied it to you first, years ago, and it's stuck. Maybe you've watched yourself repeat this pattern so many times that you've stopped questioning it and started accepting it as a personality trait, as just who you are, a lazy person. I want to spend some time today dismantling that word. Not to let anyone off the hook for their choices, but because lazy is one of the least psychologically accurate words in common use, and the story hiding underneath it is so much more interesting and so much more actionable than the word itself ever allowed. Here is the first thing worth knowing. Laziness, as a stable character trait, something a person simply is, intrinsically, permanently, is not well supported by psychological research. What looks like laziness from the outside is almost always one of several specific identifiable mechanisms, and each of those mechanisms has a different cause, a different logic, and a different path forward. Calling all of them laziness is like calling chest pain, headache, and fatigue all the same illness because they're all uncomfortable. The surface experience looks similar. What's driving it is entirely different. So let's go underneath the surface. The most common thing masquerading as laziness is something called task aversion, and it lives specifically in the emotional brain rather than the rational one. Here's what happens. You have a task. Somewhere in your mind, that task is associated with a feeling. Maybe it's the anxiety of not knowing if you'll do it well enough. Maybe it's the boredom of something genuinely tedious. Maybe it's a subtle sense of shame connected to the subject matter, or resentment toward the person who assigned it, or just the vague dread of having to fully concentrate when your brain would rather do anything else. The task arrives in your awareness carrying emotional weight, and your brain, which is fundamentally an experience management system, moves away from it. Not because you're lazy, because the task feels bad before you've even started. Timothy Pitchell, a psychologist at Carleton University who has spent decades studying procrastination, argues that what we call procrastination, and by extension, much of what we call laziness, is primarily an emotion regulation problem, not a time management problem. We're not failing to schedule correctly, we're avoiding feelings. The task gets put off not because we lack discipline, but because our nervous system is treating it as an emotional threat and doing what nervous systems do, steering away from threat. This reframe matters enormously, because if the problem is emotional avoidance, the solution isn't trying harder or being stricter with yourself. It's working with the emotional association, making the approach to the task feel less threatening, starting smaller, so the emotional cost of beginning drops to something manageable. The issue was never willpower, it was always feelings. Then there's the role of meaning, and this one is perhaps the most underappreciated driver of what looks like laziness in adults. The human brain is extraordinarily selective about where it allocates energy. It is not a machine that runs at constant output. It is a biological system that modulates effort based on perceived return. When you're working towards something that your deeper self genuinely values, something that feels connected to who you are and where you want to go, the brain releases dopamine in anticipation of progress. Effort feels generative. Time disappears. You look up and 3 hours have passed and you feel more awake than when you started. But when you're working towards something that has no connection to what you actually care about, a goal imposed from outside, a task that serves someone else's vision rather than your own, work that pays the bills but touches nothing in you, the brain doesn't release that anticipatory dopamine. Effort feels like friction. Every small resistance looms large. The couch becomes irresistible not because you're lazy, but because your deeper self is quietly, persistently refusing to spend its finite energy on something it is determined is not worth the cost. Viktor Frankl wrote about meaning as a fundamental human drive. The will to meaning, he called it. When that drive is unfulfilled, when a person moves through their days doing things that feel disconnected from any larger purpose, a kind of existential exhaustion sets in. It looks from the outside exactly like laziness. It feels from the inside like heaviness without a clear source. But it isn't a character defect, it's a signal. The signal is, this isn't your life yet. This isn't the direction. Something needs to change at a deeper level than your morning routine. There is also, and this requires some gentleness to talk about, the connection between what looks like laziness and what is actually depression, or anxiety, or ADHD, or burnout. These are not rare exceptions. They are extraordinarily common, and they produce behavioral profiles that are virtually indistinguishable from laziness to an outside observer, and even, often, to the person themselves. Depression doesn't always look like crying in darkness. It frequently looks like nothing. Like lying on the couch for hours. Like starting things and not finishing them. Like a flatness of motivation that makes even enjoyable activities feel like obligations too heavy to lift. ADHD doesn't look like hyperactivity in many adults. It looks like an inability to initiate tasks, a failure to follow through, a pattern of starting with enthusiasm and stalling completely that the person themselves cannot explain and has spent years interpreting as a personal moral failure. Burnout looks like someone who used to be capable and productive and is now inexplicably unable to care about anything, moving through their days at half speed, wondering what happened to the person they used to be. All of these get labeled lazy by employers, by family members, by the people themselves. And the label does something insidious. It forecloses curiosity. It ends the inquiry. Once you've decided the explanation is character, you stop asking what else might be going on. And the actual cause goes unaddressed, sometimes for years. There is also something worth naming about the environment, about systems, about the fact that motivation is not purely internal. It is profoundly shaped by the context you're operating in. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that the same person, in different environments, produces dramatically different output. This is the insight behind habit design. The idea, explored extensively by researchers like B.J. Fogg at Stanford, that behavior is less about intention and more about friction. High-friction environments produce low output. Low-friction environments produce high output. The person didn't change. The conditions did. If your workspace is chaotic, if your goals are vague, if there's no structure that carries you from intention to action, if every step toward the thing requires clearing 20 obstacles first, you will produce less. Not because your character is deficient, but because you've designed a system that makes action hard and inaction easy. And the brain, being a magnificent efficiency machine, will always choose the path of least resistance when everything else is equal. That's not a flaw. That's intelligence optimizing for available conditions. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us, I think, in a much more useful place than the word lazy ever could. Because every mechanism we've talked about today, emotional avoidance, disconnection from meaning, underlying mental health conditions, environmental friction, is something that can actually be worked with. None of them are permanent. None of them are identity. They are conditions, patterns, systems. And systems can be changed. The place to start is not trying harder. It is getting curious. The next time you catch yourself not doing the thing, instead of reaching immediately for the self-criticism, try asking, what does this task feel like right now emotionally? What am I avoiding, the task or the feeling the task brings? Does this connect to anything I actually care about? What would make starting this feel less like a threat and more like a choice? Those questions are not soft alternatives to discipline. They are more rigorous than discipline. Because discipline applied to the wrong diagnosis does nothing but exhaust you. Understanding applied to the right one changes everything. You are not a lazy person. You are a person whose brain is behaving logically in response to conditions that haven't been fully examined yet. And that, unlike character, is entirely workable. If this landed somewhere real for you, if you recognized yourself or someone you love in any of this, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the surprisingly logical reasons behind the things we do and don't do, stick around. There's always more worth understanding.